All right, everybody, welcome back to another episode. In our previous lesson, we were talking about variables, and we were talking about numbers, specifically integers. We did a little math with those numbers, and we saved them to various variables, and we talked about the ways that you can get feedback from Xcode to make sure that you know that everything is actually going correctly without even having to build or run your code. Before we get started, I just want to remind you that if you already have some experience programming and you want to go ahead and just jump right into building the app, go ahead and jump to episode 6. That's where we actually start building out the components that'll be our final calculator app. In this episode, we're going to go a little farther. We're going to start by talking about functions, and then we're going to go a little bit farther. We're going to talk about another type of number, which is called a double. Now, if you remember where we left off last time, we had two variables. One was what the user typed in, and what was the number sign inverter, and we multiplied those two together, and we never actually saw the output of that, the result of that. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce you to a function that's called print. Now, function is just a way of taking some behavior, some sort of functionality, and wrapping it up in a concise piece of code. Now, in this case, print is a special function that's provided to us that prints out whatever we hand it to the console. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to hit this play button up here, and the play button compiles and runs our code. And you're going to see it launches a simulator that's supposed to simulate an iPhone. Now you can see it's supposed to be an iPhone 11 Pro Max, and it even kind of looks like an iPhone, but it's blank. And that's because we haven't provided any user interface. So that's kind of expected. Now the other thing that is kind of expected is when we called print in our code for it to print it out. Now where does it print it out? It prints it out down here at the bottom. Now, if you remember, I showed you a little bit around the user interface. Up here in the top right corner, you can show and hide various panels. And so if the bottom panel isn't showing for some reason, you can go ahead and click and make it appear. Now you can see it prints the result of our multiplication, which was 10 times -1. So it prints -10 down here in what's called the console. Now this is pretty good, but if you remember what we talked about last time, we had the concept of an integer, and we explained that that is a number that doesn't have a fraction or a decimal component to it, which makes sense if you look at our numbers that we've got 10 and -1, and even when we option click on them, Xcode knows that these are variables and that they're integers. The interesting thing here is that it also knows that result of multiplication is an integer, and it knows that because we multiplied two integers together. And obviously the result of multiplying two integers together is another integer. Now, we didn't do division, and division is the one that is interesting with integers. If you divide an integer and it's going to have a remainder to it, like let's say the result is 10.5, it's going to go ahead and drop that decimal because, like we said, integers can't have a decimal place. So if we pop back over to the Swift documentation, which we showed you in a previous episode, you can see that there are what we call floating point and double numbers. And both of these represent various kinds of numbers that have amounts of precision to their decimal places. Let's break that down. Now we understand the second part, which is decimal places. You can see even in the examples that they give here in the top paragraph, 3.14159, that's a decimal place, -273.15. Now the difference between a double and a float is what's called precision. So that means how many decimal places you can have and still have the calculations that it do actually be correct and not have to be rounded off. Now in our case, since we're making a calculator app, we're just going to go ahead and err on the side of more accuracy, and we're going to use a double. The double is double the accuracy of our float, and so we're going to go ahead and we're going to change the type of our variables. We're going to make some doubles so that when we do our math, we will actually get our decimal place accuracy like we would expect to get from a calculator app. Now you can do that by just typing a colon and then typing in double. And if you option click again here and pull up our inspector, you'll see that what previously was an integer is now a double, and it recognizes it's a double, even though the number that we assigned it to, 10, is still the same. It turns out that 10 and 10.0 are the same thing. And so doubles can represent some of the same numbers as integers, just with the added benefit of being able to have a decimal place. Now you'll see as soon as we do that, it introduces a new error, and it says binary operator multiplication cannot be applied to operands of, and if we expand it, you could see integer and double. It can't multiply a double and an integer by each other. And the reason is because it doesn't know what you would expect to get from that. If you remember when we talked about dividing integers, how it would drop the decimal place, well, when you divide doubles, it doesn't drop the decimal place. And so if you're mixing two types, we actually don't know what the outcome would be expected to be. And so to avoid any confusion, they just go ahead and they enforce a rule that the types of numbers that you're going to perform operations on have to be of the same type as each other. So let's fix the error. We're just going to come up here and we're going to type :double again. Now, as you can see, that changes the type of our number sign inverter to a double, and then it suddenly changes our error back to variable result of multiplication was never mutated. And so we can go ahead, we know how to solve that from the previous lesson. We just changed that to a let variable instead of a var. And the interesting thing here is if we go ahead and option click on result of multiplication, you'll see that it was smart enough to determine, oh, hey, they're not multiplying two integers anymore. They're multiplying two doubles. And so result of multiplication variable is no longer an integer, it's a double. And that's called type inference. Type inference is where it's able to infer or kind of deduce or figure out the result or the type that something should be based on the other things around it. And in this case, since we are multiplying two doubles, the result of multiplying two doubles is another double. So you can see, let's go ahead and press the play button again and run it, and you'll see it pulls up our simulator and it's blank still. But if we come back down to our console, you'll see that it now prints -10.0, and that's because a double prints out a little bit differently. It shows that it has the capability of showing off a decimal place, which is pretty awesome. All right, so we've talked about type inference, or being able to infer, and we've even explicitly given the type of some variables. So let's talk about one more, and this is a way that you can convert one type of variable into another variable. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to create a new variable down here. We're going to explicitly call it a double, and we're going to assign the value to 10.5, so it has a decimal. And now for our second variable, integer, we're going to do what is called conversion. We're going to convert a double into an integer. And what you can do is if you type int and wrap it in parentheses, this is a special function that's called an initializer. And it initializes, or it creates, a new integer. And in our case, it creates a double. So if we go ahead and we print out the double and the integer, again, we've got a blank screen, which was what we expected. But before I reveal the console, if you remember, it printed -10.0 for the result of multiplication. What do you think it's going to print for double and for integer? Well, let's see. You can see it's still printed -10.0 as the first thing, but then you can see 10.5, and that makes sense because it was a double. Now the third, which was an integer, but it was created out of a double, you can see is 10, and it doesn't have the decimal place the way the first one does. You can see that because we converted our double into an integer, it did what we expected it to do. It dropped all of the fractional components, or the decimal components, and that turned our 10.5, which is our original number, into 10. And you can see that's reflected down here below in the things that are being printed out. All right, everybody, that's it for this one. Our next episode is going to be a quick lesson going a little bit deeper on more types. So additional information on number types, but also some other types that we haven't seen before that'll be useful to understand. Hope you enjoy it. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll catch you on the next one.